Welcome this afternoon to this World Building Live session here in How To. You saw in the trailer 252 talents coming from 77 countries, and also part of the talents group, we have also selected 12 production designers, and they already started working yesterday with a group of experts here. And we would like now to invite the audience and to take part in this series here of workshops. And I would like to introduce you to Juan Diaz-B. He is the European Director of the World Building Institute. The World Building Institute is based in Los Angeles, and we have since many, many years cooperation with the Institute. Welcome, Juan. You've been also a former participant of this program 10, 12 years ago already. And thank you for this long journey together. And you will introduce the panelists and experts of the world building here.
Thank you. Hello, welcome. And first of all, we have to thank the talents because it really has been already so many years collaborating with the event and growing up with the events, because really we started in a process that has brought us to really have a space of cross-disciplinary collaboration and reshaping how we create. So let me give you a small context of what we are doing here. The production design studio, which is at the base of what we are doing, is run through what we have developed through many years that is called world building. We will give you an introduction to world building, but the idea is that this is an open session in which we want you to participate with us and with our guests to continue the work that we have started already in a private session. So please, as we work and as we move, bring your own thoughts and questions to what we are gonna give to you as a provocation, okay? So initially I'm gonna introduce our guests who come, as we were saying, from very different disciplines, because this is the way we work. So I'm gonna start from here. Ana López Ortegó, she has a collective that is called Arquitectura Expandida in Bogotá, and she's working with the communities to create solutions for the situations that are oppressing the territory in their own communities. And it's creating solutions that actually are bringing the communities to be empowered and self-reliant, that they can manage their own solutions. I mean, we will hear from them further throughout the session. Then we have Paul Mo, who is a professor in Northern Ireland, and also he has been developing projects to create solutions coming from the visual arts to bring together the communities in Northern Ireland after the division, the long division in decades, and we will hear about that because this is one of the starting points for our work. Then General Jeff, who is a hip-hop pioneer and a community activist in Skid Row in Los Angeles, and also we'll hear about that context in which we are working. And Leia Saidiko, who is from the UNDP, and she is running the Eurasia program in Istanbul and trying to understand new strategies through technology and to community engagement for solutions for several countries and the different problematics that come out in different territories. And now we have Alex McDowell, who is the director of the Institute, and he will give us a little bit of an overview of a few projects in which already the process has been applied. And from there, we'll depart to try to extract the components of what is the process that we're following, starting with an interactive session on the two provocations that we're bringing to you, okay? So this is gonna be very brief, but from the beginning, please bring your own questions to us. Okay.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for being here. So I'm gonna, as Juan says, I'm gonna talk a little bit about our world building process, give you a couple of examples. We are looking all the time at ways of looking at the future differently or the present differently. In this case, we have something we haven't really done before, which is looking at the past and creating an alternate flow into the present, essentially making the present a product of the fictional process that world building is. This is not doing its thing. Okay. This is locked. Hold on. All right. Excuse me one moment. Entire thing. One, you riff a little bit. Give me a second.
So one of the things that we are going to try to challenge here, because our community and probably we have a very diverse disciplinary group, but what we are trying to do here is challenge the linear way in which we are doing things. Not only because we are constructing here different narratives in a future in which we don't know actually what are the substrates in which we are going to tell the stories, but because we have been doing it in a very linear way that only preferences a few figures within the process. And cinema, it's an inheritedly collaborative process, but we have been doing it in a very industrial way, trying to construct narratives that are linear and therefore also constraining the capacities of a team. So one of the things that we're gonna show you is processes in which a team that actually it's bringing together all the stakeholders to the table to really bring solutions that develop out of the construction of a world and how these stories emerge from the world in an ecological way. One of the things that we are constantly constrained to is by the ideals of what is the structure of cinema, right? The director, the producer, and then this linear path in which our production designers or other disciplines are disconnected from each other. The processes that we are developing are being applied both into the entertainment system, but also for projects that are aimed for the real world, to bring change to the real world. Because at the end, narrative, it's a tool that can be applied to any kind of ecosystem. So I'm actually gonna jump to the other side. I'm gonna bring you the two contexts in which we are departing on the workshop, and then we're gonna go back to show some of the processes in how we develop the world building methodology into a narrative. So I'm gonna give it to you, Paul. We started with two provocations within the workshop so that we could see how we could go back to the past and develop an alternative history of that past. And what we're gonna bring is a new present into narrative. So usually we will build for the future, but we're gonna try to understand what we did wrong and how those mistakes could be brought to a different storyline into a present that we yet don't know. Okay, Paul.
Thank you, Juan. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, although slightly annoyed on two counts. One, that I'm not a hip-hop pioneer. And secondly, that not for the first time today, I'm the oldest person in the room. However, being the oldest person in the room does mean that you have some experience, and it can hopefully bring some experience to what we're trying to do and what we're trying to look at. And what I'd like you to imagine in terms of, if you like, a fictional place, is a place that has been riven for 50 years by community warfare. A place that is divided, a place where there are 30-foot walls to keep the communities apart, but a place where that kind of division is driven by the actual power structures within that area, by the politicians who control it, by the paramilitary organizations who also seem to benefit from this kind of community warfare. And I want you to imagine also that this is a place that is completely dominated by class. Now, I know many of you will come from a background where the class structure is not so rigid, but you've all seen movies about England, so you know how class-ridden that is. And if you are fortunate enough to come from the working class, you spend your life fighting that and fighting that class system. But this is a fictional region which is absolutely dominated by the class system. And it is an area that cannot escape that class system, whether it's in sport, whether it's in schooling, whether it is in any area of the social structure. What has happened, of course, is that because of this, the infrastructures in this area have developed to ensure that the division stays. So even in town planning, you have social housing created, whereby there is only one entrance into a social housing estate. And that social housing estate is kept under constant surveillance to ensure that those people do not misbehave when they're in those places. It's an area where the roads are constructed, where the motorways are put through that region in order to ensure that the two communities will never meet one another. So the actual infrastructure is put in that way. It's an infrastructure where the schools are set up to ensure that the two sides will never meet, even though they do the same examinations and they sit the same examinations on the same day. They never actually meet to school. It's a region where the ideologies are constructed to keep them apart, where the two religions are constructed to keep them apart, even though the religions themselves are only an indication of a much deeper social and economic problem. It's a region which was once in Victorian times the industrial heartland of the British Empire. It's a region where ships were launched, where aeroplanes were built, where the tobacco industry flourished. But all those industries are now gone. And what do we replace them with? Where can we find a non-sectarian form of industry that might replace that? Could it be the creative industries? Could it be that the young people don't want anymore to work in this kind of bifurcated state? Could it be that the creative industries are the new heavy industries? And what would that mean if we were to use the creative industries to try and solve a social and community problem? It's a region where violence can break out at any moment, and where violence has become so prevalent that it becomes part of the joking of an area. And we have jokes about the fact that people keep their grandmother in a room upstairs and cut pieces of her limbs off so they can claim the compensation for it under the Troubles. It's an area where black humour has to pervade in order to survive this. And the questions we need to ask is, how do we find a way to move away from this? Crucially, all that I've described to you is enshrined in the narratives that we tell, enshrined in the stories that we tell. So you have young people who go to school and who are told that candles are the work of the devil. And so they can never ever see candles in the same way again. Which, trust me, is very disconcerting on Valentine's night. Because it means you can never have a beautiful candlelit dinner with someone special. These are the fabrics that underpin this fictional space. And the question we need you to think about is, how do we escape this? What are the new narratives that we need to tell in order to shift the old thinking and to undermine that infrastructure and to find a way to take us into what the great poet Seamus Heaney called the history of sea change? What is the nostalgia we need to bring to the present in order to make the future viable? Thank you.
Thank you. General?
Thank you, Berlinale Talents, for having me. Thank you, Juan. Thank you, Andy. My name is General Jeff from Skid Row in Los Angeles. For those that have never heard of it, Skid Row, let me hear you say Skid Row. Skid Row. Let me hear you say Skid Row. Skid Row. That's about all the hip hop you're gonna get out of me today. So now that we understand, that people understand what Skid Row is, how many people in your house are homeless currently here? No one. What makes someone homeless? How did someone become homeless? Was it design? Was it their own fate? Or was there some external energy or entity that reduce them to a state of homelessness? Those are a lot of questions that need to be answered if we're talking about getting to a true finality in terms of truly ending homelessness. So I'm excited to be here today so that we can actually put forth the necessary topics and the framework so that we all can actually legitimately think about it all on the same wavelength. When you think about a veteran that fights for the war, for any war, for any government, when the war is over or when they finish their term, when they come home, if they can't function in society, they become homeless. Some of them do. Whose fault is that? Who's responsible for that? Is it that individual soldier, or is it the government? Or is it us, we the people in society? If there is a woman that's or man that's in a domestic violent relationship, a victim, and they want to escape the violence in their home, they have nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to, and they become homeless to escape that wrath. Whose fault is it? Is it her own? Is it a bad choice? Or is it society's fault for not having the safety net to keep her protected? What about innocent children and families that where the parents or the guardians have struggled, whether it's through extreme poverty or some other unforeseen circumstances, to where the family is now homeless? Why should the children be to blame? Whose fault is that? Who's responsible for helping? We as a society, what are we to do to truly end homelessness? Those are just three scenarios. Homelessness is on a case-by-case basis. Two obvious scenarios are people that are mentally ill and people that struggle with substance abuse. How do we help them if they reduce themselves or society reduces them to a state of homelessness? What are the solutions? What is the path? What is the process? What is the conversation to get to that point? This energy here today is about that conversation, about creating that path to get to those necessary solutions to help better our entire society. And we haven't even have to mention race and the systemic oppression that goes on not only in America, but around the world. Who's responsible for ending that? Who's responsible for creating a truly safe space that we all can heal and live in harmony with? Those are the questions that I pose to you, and the conversation is going to continue. Specifically in Skid Row, there are nonprofit organizations and charities who are entrusted to take care of homeless individuals and families. But they actually get a paycheck and they get funding as long as homelessness continues to exist. So if they fail to end homelessness because they're profiting off of it, that means they've learned how to monetize homelessness. And so as long as homelessness continues, they'll continue to get a check. That's capitalism in America. And that's the same type of structure that's going on around the world. Who's to hold them accountable? Where's the transparency? Where's the oversight? There's a lot of questions that need to be answered, and we're going to be holding that. We hopefully can get through there some of that today. Thank you.
Thank you. So these are two departing points on our workshop. As you see, it's two different subjects, but as we have been seeing throughout our first session, they start being connected in the forces that have shaped these situations and have brought these situations to happen. One of the things that we believe is that narrative is the same as getting to know the world. And through narrative, we can change that knowledge of the world. So are we ready there, Alex? Yeah? Yes. So the idea is that precisely we are going to tackle these issues by being storytellers of a different future. So what we did this year, because we have been asked many times, can we rebuild for the past, is going back to something that we know and not by thinking the technologies that will be developed. Those will help us to develop a different future, but with the processes and technologies that we had, what could have been different if we would have thought in a different way?
So thanks for your patience with my crazy technology. This quote by Yuval Harari seems really relevant to our work and really to everything that I think we should be thinking about at the moment. As Juan says, you know, we normally, in a wide range of different areas, we consider that we're prototyping the future, that we're building on as much base of knowledge and research, and then moving forward from that, incrementally starting to learn about the way that we would like the future to be, develop that vision, and then thread it back to the present, and use that process to shift what we're doing in the present to move towards a future that is different. So it's very different than a futurist, traditionally, who will take a trend or a series of trends and then extrapolate those forward, because those trends are setting that course. And we know from every type of thing that's going on around us at the moment that shifting is completely feasible. In fact, it's almost inevitable that we're going to constantly be undermined in our expectations by something that changes, like a cell phone, for example, that nobody was really imagining in year 2000. So we're taking that same process here and we're moving ourselves backwards and then prototyping a future which is now. That's one piece of it. The other thing is that, as the Harari quote is indicating, this is a present problem, if you like. Change is really necessary, and we are really invested in the idea of change in the real world. It turns out, although my background is in fiction, in production design and film, that reality is a lot more interesting. I have to do this manually now. And we think this quote represents the solution in many ways, which is just, instead of building on all of the knowledge and history and tradition that we have been used to understand as being our way forward, to build on that, perhaps it's time to really rethink that in terms of what our expectations. And so this quote by Buckminster Fuller, I think, is a great way to provoke a different way of thinking. It doesn't mean let go of tradition, because there's a huge amount of history that's incredibly valuable to us. But it does mean that the model on which we build the way in which we think about our present and our future can absolutely be changed. So I'm going to show a couple of projects that we're involved in. Who knows what this is? Other than everybody who I told this morning. Anybody? So this is a tiny piece of the chemical structure of a pancreatic beta cell. It represents an esoteric language that is understood only by molecular biologists. Even other biologists have a problem. I don't think other biologists understand it. What was interesting is I was approached by a professor at USC, a professor of biology, and he joined USC, which is the school in Southern California where I teach, because of the School of Cinema, because he believed that science is terrible at telling stories, and that he needed to join forces with storytellers in order to shift the way science moves forward, actually. So the issue here for him is that he can't collaborate with anybody. As we were talking, it became interesting to discover that this, which probably you do recognize, this is a tiny piece of Los Angeles. It's actually Skid Row primarily. That this city of Los Angeles has about the same complexity of system as the pancreatic beta cell, as a single pancreatic beta cell. So we were able to start off with the idea that we could use a city as a metaphor to start translating the idea of the complexity of the pancreatic beta cell into something that was comprehensible. So this project's been going on for about a year and a half. I'm going to show you some very, very early sketches, really, prototypes of what we're doing. The idea is to take you really inside the cell. So this is also some of the complex language that biologists use, molecular biologists use. These are proteins. There's a couple of models that have been used for a long time. One is a ball and stick that you're probably familiar with, which is a sort of something like the yellow diagrams there. And then on the left, that's a ribbon model that can be rendered in a number of different ways. But again, not only are they relatively obscure in terms of visual language, but there's a lot of things missing. You're not really aware of the difference in scale. You're not really aware, as you look at this, of the functionality. You're not really aware of the difference, even in silhouette, in characterization of these different shapes. If you held one of these on a card in front of you and then replaced them, I think you'd have a problem remembering which one was which. So our job was to find kind of the Rosetta Stone. And for us, after about 6 months of sitting across a table from scientists and artists, either side of the table, hammering away at the idea of what part of a city might be a good metaphor for a cell, we kind of stumbled into the solution, which is origami. So if you look at origami, scientists, biologists have no problem with looking at protein as a series of folded forms, and architects have no problem considering origami as a basis of a building. So once we'd established that, the protein is speaking back. So this is the beginning, super early test of translating this model of insulin into origami. Every form here is actually based on the same module. So it's a completely modular system. Each component, in some form or another, is folded from a single shape, which is something like this. And every single model that we're building is based on the same module. So in terms of systems design, we can start thinking about an algorithm which comes from the chemical code into a visual code that can turn into language that becomes more recognizable. This is our process now. So we've taken that complex chart and we're looking at a single pathway through here. This essentially is the narrative. So coming back to sort of cinematic language, this is the script, the blue line. The numbers along that line are characters and intersections of characters. What's really happening is a signal is being sent into the GLP-1R on the left and being output as insulin. The pancreatic beta cell is specific to diabetes, so there's a lot of attention being paid on to this cell. But what is interesting to us as storytellers is that this script and this narrative through the script is absolutely locked. You cannot change the molecules around, you can't change the proteins around. You've got no control over the characters, you've got no control over the intent of the script. There are thousands and thousands of versions of these pathways, but each one is really set in terms of its function. So how do we deal with this in terms of story? This is what I would like to suggest is what storyboards should look like in any medium, actually, because it represents an enormous amount of information. This straight line now through the center of these forms is that pathway I just showed you. The 14 proteins along that path are at the top, so we know what all the characters are and when we intersect them. The scale is set. We know the size of the environment that we're going to be in at every path. So with a huge change of scale, so we have to consider that as a narrative problem because we aren't going to be able to recognize one size or another if we stay one size, so we have to be able to understand how we can change size. And then along the bottom, just to do a close-up, oh, sorry, I'll just go back to one thing. So what is radical for me in terms of what we can think of as story is that the only thing you can really change is the POV. And so our storytelling in a VR environment where each viewer and user has agency and can essentially go anywhere and follow this pathway from any number of angles, the story is only changed, but it's changed completely by the user and where the user chooses to look and at what scale they're looking at. So it sort of flips the model already in terms of the way we think about story. And then this is actually the storyboard. So we're currently just animating each section of this with the very low resolution models. Each of those represents the actual transaction that's happening. This is a GLP-1 entering, I only know this because I'm reading it, GLP-1 entering the, never mind, I can't remember any of the science. I'm always the most ignorant person in the room when we're with the scientists, but that's actually a huge help because then I can, not constrain myself in any way because every stupid question I ask actually moves the story forward. And then this is actually the current outcome, the prototype. There should be sound to this, but it's not important. Just lower down. So this is actually a journey through there. These are the GLP-1R that we're passing now. That's the outside membrane of the cell. You are encountering a number of different creatures in this space. Each one of them is representing a different kind of protein behavior. They are all representing absolutely specific proteins and molecules inside the pancreatic beta cell. But now they're beginning to become identifiable. They have silhouettes, they have scale, they have action, they have function, and they have geolocation. So we know where they are relative to each other, we know how big they are relative to each other. We begin to be able to make connections that no biologist has ever seen before, in fact, because you can't see the components inside the pancreatic beta cell, they're too small. So it's becoming a real transaction between storytelling and what storytelling can offer back to science, sort of in a systems design framework.
I would like to make a note there because if we think that what we are showing you is a process, right? What we can extract from a project like this is one of the main questions that we have been asking ourselves, and is how can we bring the questions from one discipline to another? So we understand that each of us is a container as much as it is an individual. And a cell is as much as a city as it is an organism. So if we think of the questions that a geologist or a microbiologist can ask, those same questions can be translated into how we design cities or how can we construct stories. So this is a progression that if you think from the cell into this individual, into the community, into the city, you can think of the city as an organism. You can think of the community as an organism as much as a container. And that duality is part of the process that we have developed. So taking from that particular project, you can see how the questions of medicine and biology can be asked to a city, but inversely, the questions of urbanism and the language of the cities can be translated into comprehending and creating a comprehensive dialogue between different partners. So it's just a kind of a meta reflection on how what you're seeing there, it's an application of some of the concepts that you can therefore apply to your own processes back in your own kind of practice.
Yeah, it's a great point. And in fact, that is actually the deal we've made with the biologists, is that we're going to steal the biological knowledge to apply to the future of cities. And the doctor that we're working with, Dr. Ray Stevens, is equally interested in that, in fact. So current cities, are built on straight lines. The grid that you saw in Los Angeles, there's no straight lines and there's no straight action inside a cell. But you can start, but it's very efficient. The way that these proteins move through the cell is intuitive. They find the best way through the cell every single time. It's never the same way twice. So if we start thinking about traffic, for example, in a different way inside an infrastructure, we're starting to apply those ideas and to see how one could take, for example, a project we did here 2 years ago, where we were looking at the future of cities when they are based in the origin of a refugee camp. So the refugee camp starts as a grid. It's a bunch of containers put down in the middle of a desert. At the moment, the average amount of time that someone spends in a refugee camp is 25 years. So there's nothing temporary about it. It's going to continue. Those are beginning to develop, but they haven't been built on the foundation of being a city. So we can really take the idea now that new cities are springing up all over the place. Refugee camps are one place, but in China there's massive cities growing. And what if you could actually start from the very ground up with an organic, biological process, biological approach to the way cities develop? This city is a fictional city that we developed for a film called Minority Report. What was specifically different and disruptive about this was there was no script when we started. So we worked for almost a year. Scott Frank and I were hired, Scott Frank, the writer, and I were hired by Steven Spielberg on the same day. The script continued in parallel with our development of the world. And we had more or less for the first time to think about the world before we had a script to break down. And it turned out to be a really interesting process because it, again, flipped the model on its head. What happened was the world developed, and then stories started emerging from that. And it was very much a collaborative process. The writer was coming in and looking at the way the world would develop and taking ideas from what he saw in the same way as he would if he was walking around a city and doing a contemporary narrative. But he could immerse himself and be inside that world. The other important thing here was that the provocation from Steven was he did not want this to be science fiction. And in order to shift this into future reality, we had to do a completely different kind of research. So we went out into the world, we went to MIT Media Lab, we went to DARPA, which is the research wing of the US military. We went to Apple, to their labs. We had this enormous access because of his name, because Spielberg's name. But what we were doing is going deeply into the current knowledge, but into research that was projecting forward. The film's kind of known for predicting many things. Over the past 15, 18 years now, the press keeps coming up with different references to new things that have been built that reference back to Minority Report. It really isn't that we were being so clever. It's because we were just listening carefully to people who were doing the real research, and most of that research has taken 10 or 15 years to emerge into the world. But that's something I think we'd call design fiction, where really the thing that you imagine, if you visualize it and you present it, can actually become real when it's embedded in fiction, and that's another huge part of the power that we have. If we think about fiction actually as a way of catapulting reality forward. So the gesture system that's known in Minority Report was actually a thesis project that had never really been built. It now exists in the world, a 300-person company. It's in massive companies all over the world, and it actually was made material by the film. This is our process. So we were creating a white papers of the future, and we were diving deeply into all of the holistic knowledge we needed for the world to develop: wearables, architecture, future of advertising, future of transportation. Just as an example of future of transportation, this was our process. In the beginning of the art department, we were working analog. We actually had illustrators working with acrylic paint on board. By the end, we were the first fully digital art department. And the reason was that we couldn't actually portray the kind of worlds that we were imagining using traditional tools. And so this car that we developed, we asked the question, how does Tom Cruise get to work in the morning? He starts very high up in a new part of a city and then ends up in an old part of the city horizontally. So we thought if we mix an elevator and a taxi cab, perhaps we'll come up with a new kind of car. It has to rotate, so the function creates the form. It's going through a data process which is pushing it out to rapid prototyping, pushing it to illustration, pushing it into final models, and to previs, and then finally out to visual effects, all using the same data. So again, what we'd done is we'd created the data at the front end instead of allowing this Victorian industrial process that film has been for 100 years to wait for every step of the process before it knows what it has. We've been able to actually completely synchronize the intent with the outcome. And so the other thing we discovered after the film was released, after we'd built this world, is that if one considers this holistic space, a container for narrative, within which you could apply multiple different lenses. We could have asked questions of the world around urban planning, for example, around the future of advertising, around new technologies, around transportation. And we could have had all of that world apply only to those outcomes. So we're using this kind of process to do urban design right now. We're building a world in the same way, we're creating characters in the same way, we're driving those through the world, but we're using them for completely different outcomes. So this becomes kind of the basis of transmedia, but it also comes the basis of an application in multiple different spaces.
Yeah, here I think the note will be, and when Alex and I met, we met actually in this very same room, by the way. And we always celebrate that because of two things. And it's the fact that we were in a completely different scale. I saw this presentation 12 years ago, and I was doing a project in a completely...
Was it exactly the same?
Was exactly the same room. At the presentation, yeah, okay. It has variated. But I saw those slides, and we were doing the same process in a very different way with different techniques, but we were thinking holistically. And this is how we started the collaboration. And why I say this is because often we get questions on how can we do that if we don't have the resources. But it's about how you approach, how you visualize. And now it's cheaper and cheaper to make these kind of things as a tool for your production. But it's also about how you approach the thought. And why I want to say that is because, in general, it's about how you frame the collaboration. Because what Alex is saying is, we were listening, we were asking. And on our own scale, we were doing the same. We were trying to question the world and question like the parameters of that story that we were telling. So at the end, this is a process that is completely scalable, from the dimension of Minority Report to the project that you have right now and that you're doing and that you're trying to decompose, to comprehend. So challenge your world through the same process. Question, bring people that actually can bring other questions to it, and then scale all what you're listening here into creating a world and allowing, and that's the most important part, the stories to emerge. Don't force the stories into the world that you are creating. Understand what are the parameters in which you are starting, and that allow yourself to see the stories that start emerging, and then bring the stories to be part of that world and not forcing the world to clash with them. One of the things that we are challenging is the idea that the writer is creating as it writes. We have changed the metaphor of the writer for the metaphor of the chronicler, one that explores a world and creates a chronic of what it's seeing. That changes completely the metaphor of the writer. That's not the author of the world. It's one that allows us to tell the story of the world that it's experiencing. Okay? So.
Yeah, I think that's great. And a couple of quick sort of developments of those ideas. The project we're doing in the lab around the pancreatic beta cell is being done with incredibly cheap equipment. Virtual reality headset is, $600 probably, compared to the cost of a camera 10 years ago. Your cell phone is a good camera these days. The cost of writing code, which is a huge part of that project, is just the cost of the people doing it. So the opportunity to do new kinds of media, new kinds of outcome is actually getting easier and easier and cheaper and cheaper. The same thing applies to what you're saying about story, is that once the world's created, you don't come into it thinking, I'm going to make a film. You come into it saying, I'm going to build a world, and the medium, the correct platform is going to present itself at the appropriate time. And that could be a book or a radio station or a VR project or a video. So we've got enormous opportunities to apply this to all sorts of different outcomes just by being open-minded. Let me just give a setup to this. So this is a project we did, let's see, I think 5 years ago. The question here was, how could a Bedouin tribe that had been forcibly settled at an oasis where their herds basically destroyed all of the crops and turned the land that would normally have been regenerated because they were nomadic into dust, how could they start building from the ground up a new sustainable town, village town, that would change their lives, but to build it themselves. And so our challenge here, or the question being asked of us, was how could we visualize that in a way that the people doing the work, the tribe themselves, would be able to enter and understand the possible outcomes of the work that they were doing at the beginning, which is just stacking bricks. How could that look in 10 years' time? So very much applied to the real world and applied to the idea of architecture, sustainability, and permaculture in a very, very inhospitable land. So I'll let Mona Hamdi, who was leading this project, who was the client, just speak about it. So one of the great outcomes here that's kind of miraculous is that the permaculturalist who's been working here now for, I think, nearly 10 years, developed a process that would take the rain that fell once every 5 years and use it to grow crops that were sustainable by capturing that water and allowing it to filter slowly through the system. So now there are crops in this village there's, I think, an acre of crops that are delivering food back to the community. So again, this is something we're able to kind of work alongside extremely knowledgeable experts and develop a vision and serve the final outcome in the real world.
And actually that brings something. We have been together working on developing world building further and further and further as a narrative method, but what we have come to realize is that actually it's a tool to expand your mind. It's a philosophy of mind to create new possibilities in the way we see the world. And this realization, it's, I think, the most important one, because what you see there, it's, at least in my belief, why we are doing what we are doing. We're telling stories so that we can transform the world, that we can influence what we are seeing. And based on that belief, I think what you're seeing here is it's just a glimpse of the possibilities that you have on using narratives to transform what we are seeing and what we are living right now. There is power in being a storyteller. And by using the right approach to break those boundaries, you can create a new narrative to change what it's not working or what needs to be challenged in our world. So on that note,
should we quickly go through the process?
Yes, of course.
So this is just a glimpse of how the process is based, a kind of system, methodology for the very front end, and then how it develops through. So first of all, you need a very wide range of knowledge in order to be able to make the most, to actually exploit the world that you've built. And the other thing that's worth noting is that the people who we hire in our studio are very multidisciplinary in themselves. They are essentially art scientists, because if you hire someone who is a specialist, let's say a filmmaker, where that's their entire knowledge, then if we develop a world and it turns out that game is the right platform, then the filmmaker's really not going to be very helpful. So we need increasingly, and I think we all need to learn this future, that we need to be very, very adept at moving between all of the skill sets we need, which include architecture, systems design, visual storytelling, live experience, that's the sort of theatrical experience, interactive media, immersive product. And we're doing it in a process that begins in inception and design through deep research, prototyping, continually redoing that in a non-linear way so that you're always prototyping over and over again, and it's not a linear process. And then finally into production, because this process is about building stuff. It's not an academic idea. It's about how we actually create something that can create change, or entertainment, in fact. Just also briefly, this is sort of a bit overwhelming if we go too deep, but the basic premise is that this represents the world that we build. The outer circle is essentially the content, the context. So we need to know where we are and when we are. We need to know what the conditions are that drive a particular world. So for example, if the story we're telling is about Paris in 1660, then we're going to be using a different set of information and different context than if we're writing a story about Mars in the year 3000. But the same process applies. You just need to understand the conditions of the world and the rules of the world. And then we move in, metaphorically, we move from the world space into, let's say, the city. Again, it's a metaphor, but you saw as a metaphor applied to the cell. But it can also be the village that represents Albedo. And at that scale, we're looking at the high level of governance, infrastructure, culture, and resources, how those are being driven perhaps at the scale of the city, at the urban planning scale, and then moving into a neighborhood. So what conditions exist on the ground in a space that we know much more intimately, but begins to establish another set of rules. And then into the center via the street corner, which we consider to be really the important metaphor here, that a street corner is a small enough component of the world to be able to inform you deeply about the world. It's a microcosm of the whole, but it's manageable. You can examine a street corner and all of its complexity, but it still is not thousands of people, it's not thousands of buildings. You can really start examining it as a metaphor, but a metaphor that's applicable to its own world at larger scale. So we're spending a lot of time really kind of analyzing and trying to work out how the street corner becomes its own coded space. And then from that, you move into the center, and the human characters or the characters that develop out of the knowledge of the world, and you push those characters back into the world. So that moves into what we'd call domains. If they are a music maker, they're going to go into the direction of music and hacking and some technology down into the culture space. If they're engineers or architects, they're going to go towards infrastructure. They'll start intersecting very specific parts of the world, and that in turn tests the world. So we can run 100 characters through the world. Each character makes the world more and more intact, richer and richer. But the example of the transaction is perhaps in the healthcare system. So at the government level, healthcare is mandated. It's developed. It starts pushing down to the hospital. The healthcare center works within that healthcare system. The patient comes into the hospital, is being cared for within that system, but the needs of the patient push back on the hospital, and the hospital pushes back on the healthcare system. And so it's really a transaction that over time is absolutely integral on both sides. And so what we can start developing is how the power of the individual, the power of the character in the center, can actually start creating the world that character needs it to be.
Yeah, and some of the concepts that you see here, without going in depth, because we want to collaborate with you to work on the stories, but the idea of an ecology is because of what we were saying. There's different scales, right? So the questions that we are making, it's, for example, if we think of scaling up questions of the body, we can ask, what is the health of a city? If we think of the way that we are caring for ourselves, and we ask that for a city, if we think about it as an organism. And in that sense, we understand this collaboration going in one scale to the larger scale, and so on and so forth. And as Alex was saying, this process repeats. Doesn't matter in what scale. If you're in the world, you ask those questions with a different context, but that's your individual that you're working on. And if you're seeing from above, from the point of view of the world into the city, then you ask those questions to the city as if you will ask it to a character. That way you start understanding also other knowledge that is not encoded yet in the disciplines that are supposed to be treating the city. And that kind of cross-disciplinary questions are going to bring you to a different level of storytelling as well. Because it's metaphors that are going to be unlocking through this kind of transversal and divergent questions. Okay. So should we start with the session? Okay. We probably will go back to some of these concepts as we are moving on. But the first thing is we have two provocations here, right? And the question is, we have these two places with these particular structures and forces that have been shaping those. So the question here is, what could have been changed so that what we know now of these places that have this present would be different? What kind of questions could we ask to those places to understand what could have been changed so that a different vector in the history could have brought to a present that would be different from what we know now?
In concerns to the story that we're building, correct? I would say that there would have to have been some sort of major change in government over time. The government would have probably had to have been much more of a tyrannical government, much power-hungry, wanting the rich to get richer and for them to become bigger on their own terms. Creating, I would say, building-wise, much more intimidating structural like buildings, much like how we see in like old Rome, and like that's just an idea that I have.
You will think that that's a solution for which problem?
The problem of what happened in the past, of what could have caused this division of state, something with the government wanting to search for more and more power, and wanting them to just become richer and richer, thus creating a divide thank you, and thus creating a severe divide between the what is it called, the classes, between just the upper and lower and middle classes.
Right. So we have there already a force that it's precisely power, and how power is trying to be developed into a city or a community, and how that affects the microcosm of these particular places, you know? Because structures of power already in place have definitely shaped the places in which the power is not being seen. Anyone has already an idea or a question?
Wait for a microphone, please.
Major alliances between universities and local universities, so that there are ambassadors from the local intelligentsia, intellectual community, science, and obviously new media and all the animated elements, so that the first world, very well-resourced institutions are not coming in and we have the answers. So those partnerships will be crucial, as well as getting these scholars from the local areas to be well supported in the Western universities, so that they can come back and be well supported as they try to infiltrate into local communities and make these types of changes.
Paul, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah. I have two issues with that. I think you're right that there is a responsibility for academics to face those problems. The two issues that I would have in the fictional place I was talking about was that the academic institutions actually represented the elitism, which was part of the problem. And secondly, the people who were in conflict had no understanding of the culture of those places that would have allowed them to enter them. So the process of deconstructing the society actually needs to happen within the academy. And the academy needs to recognize that sometimes the forms of research that we're doing do not necessarily dovetail with what the communities need at any given time. And I don't mean to be kind of contradictory, but I think it's the academies which need to change, not the communities.
And if we go further, just from that note, if you think about what the academy represents, it's also the ideals and ideologies that have been already perpetuated into institutions that we know. So some of the things that we have to think on how to change the narrative is what is perpetuating the narrative. That's one of the first things that we have to think about on the characteristics of places like this. If we continue with the same narrative and we try to understand how, as Alex was quoting Burgmeister Fuller, the same system is going to try to change itself, that's never going to happen. Because a system, the nature of a system, is survival. And that permanence is something that we cannot allow if we really want to transform something. So I think challenging the ideologies and the ideals that have produced, as we were saying, the emergence of that institution is the first thing. Because the ideals that we have now are producing the future that will exist. Because every choice that we are making right now, it's encoded, right, in those ideals. Those ideals are the ones that actually move our choices into the future. So those are the first things that have to be hacked, right?
So push that back into the past, and that's the same process, right? So this process that we need to go through is what kind of shifts do you make 30 years ago in the same way to create an entirely different parallel world that could give us perhaps an indication of what we have to do from here forward to get to that point.
Yeah, I mean, for example, Leah, give us a take on the different communities that you have seen that we can maybe learn the kind of problems and strategies that could be used to try to tackle these problems from the essence.
From the ethics, from the essence.
From the essence.
From the essence. Well, I maybe want to link to the comment on powers first, on the power structures. And I think, we usually talk, there's communities on the ground and there's the power and there's a gap in between. Like the power is something very abstract. But in reality, the way the power permeates is by using intermediaries who buy into a certain narrative, but more than that, who have incentives to act on behalf of power. So in fact, that building that narrative within communities doesn't happen only because there's powers who are playing certain things, but because they use people who translate things and who have an incentive to do that and to keep people apart. Or in your case, you were saying there's these charities who benefit from the system. So I think, if I think about concrete examples on how that translates, think about elections, right? And fraud in elections in some places where they're free and so on, free and fair. And usually when people think whether an election is free and fair, you'd think, could people go to the ballot box freely and put a vote? But actually, the way that elections get muddled is by buying interest, by buying the vote, not by actually making an exchange on the vote itself, but by going into communities and saying, we're going to build a road where here, if we get elected. That is a form of corruption. That is not a free and fair election because the people who are in power have the means to actually make promises like that. And that happens, I think that happens around the world, where you use the resources of a government to actually keep yourself in power. I don't know if that answers partly your question.
No, yes, and actually it's just to bring more material to precisely think what are the problematics that touch these two spaces. Because what you're talking about is exactly the fact that there are some ideals that translate into different scales. If we see what we were talking about, we have the scale of the world, the city, the individual, right? But that corruption that we're talking about here, actually, it's something that we can understand how goes from the main sources of power to the micro traffic, let's say, of influence. And this is the kind of things that we have to understand in the entire world, holistically, from how the individuals interact, but then how that it's actually both into the real world, into the bigger world, in the macro, understanding how that is affecting, but also how those interactions on the individuals are producing the system. It's a dual system in which, yes, that power is influencing the individual, but also the individuals are perpetuating that kind of power.
Yeah, I guess where my mind is going right now, too, also deals with power structures and their inevitability, as it seems. And I'm thinking, if we look at people having multidisciplinary skills, like every problem in the world is just a code we need to crack. If we understand the language, then we can rewrite the script. That's kind of what I'm hearing. But if we have people, if we need for this experts in a diverse set of fields, multidisciplinary experts, who can be the new creative designers that are the powerhouse to change the world, how does that not just create a new set of haves and have-nots for the people who are like purely focused on survival because they don't have food to eat and shoes on their feet?
That's a super good question, and definitely it must be a fluid process, but I will ask Anna to touch a little bit that subject, because Anna has been working precisely with communities and empowering the communities to be them who are creating new spaces.
Yes, I think. Okay. Hi. I think we don't have a perfect method, but we have some strategies. And for example, we really like to work in a kind of collectivity with a really common challenge, because this kind of work allows us to forget for a moment all the internal divisions. The sense of the community could be sometimes a little bit close. For example, in a religious community or university community or a political community. But when we try to have a common challenge, maybe we could be very different in one side, but we could work together around this objective. Also, I think we could find some space, relaxing space, I don't know, but party is a very good strategy to meet together and also forget another kind of difference. This kind of party or music or some cultural strategies allow to work together when we don't really speak the same language. For example, between communities and public institutions, we needed to find this common language, and sometimes it's something really really natural.
Yeah, and I think the idea of a common language is something that it's one of the essence, because what we're doing here, but also working with our community, as Anna is doing, it's about how to find the language that brings the community together. So I want to ask General Jeff and then Paul to speak about, yeah, okay, Paul.
I absolutely understand the point you're trying to make. Where I take issue with it is, your point is built around a presumption that there will be only a limited number of people with those skills who will then guide the society. Why wouldn't it be a right that everyone would have those skills, which would mean we would have to change our definition of literacy in the 21st century and ensure that children from a very early age had a literacy which involved those kind of multi-dimensional skills that we're talking about. So you would create a society which in its essence did the kind of things we were talking about, not as an expert contribution, but merely as a contribution to their civic responsibility. In the same way as universities need to become civic universities, why wouldn't that be a universal right for all young people, that they would have those skills built into their curriculum, rather than many of the skills which they're getting now, which are now obsolete? Well, I suppose I'm so institutionalized, I'm thinking about education as an institutional thing. So all young people have to go to school in any society, other than a few. They have to go to school. So what we need to change is the curriculum, because we are now, our complete education system is based on an industrial model from the 19th century, which went out of date in about 1920, based on the notion of standardization. So we need to fundamentally change that curriculum. That actually doesn't take somebody very long if they have the courage to do it.
I think we are just presuming that knowledge is coming. I'm sorry. I don't think, like, if we are just presuming that knowledge is coming for this place of the common education place, like school, high school, university. I don't know if anyone saw the movie Chow, with this. Yeah, okay. So I'm from Brazil, and the first question she made me was like, okay, this is a landless movement from Brazil. They are connected to agriculture and fighting for land and against big companies. And the first thing is like, oh, but how they are managing to, aren't they poor? How do they have the knowledge to do that? And they have the knowledge because their families are working with land from a long time, so they definitely know much more than we do about this. So maybe sometimes, I don't know, we just have to see that people who are there or live there know more and how to make the earth alive again. And yeah, I don't know if that's it.
And no, actually that's a good note, because when we talk about experts, we don't talk about academic experts. Expertise comes from everyone that actually needs to be working on a particular solution or a story. When we worked on migratory narratives, there were refugees that were working with us because we cannot imagine their story. They have to be there to be part of constructing those possibilities and new stories. So I think also linguistically, we have to break the idea that experts are only being developed in universities, because everyone has developed an expertise on their own point of view and their own life, and in things that other people that have been spending their life in academia cannot even know about, because experience is knowledge. So in that sense, it's also about changing what we think it's an expert, and bringing precisely, as Anna has been working on, or General Jeff has been working on as well, with the people to construct the solutions. Because they are people that actually are dispossessed, and they are people that are full with challenges, but also if we give the space, people actually bring their own energy to try to find that solution. If we validate them as the experts that are needed to change things, because that's the other thing. Hierarchy comes in our language, in the way that we move, in the way that we create gatherings, and this is why this room is like this, because we try to bring as closer as we could within the limitations of this space, the people, because it's about this, about creating a community in which people can bring their own questions. So it's a great question, but also it's about challenging the way that we think, the language that we use, and the metaphors that we are building our questions and answers on, right? General, do you want to?
Sure. Ooh, there's a lot to unwrap here. Well, first of all, I just want to talk about the politicians. The politicians are the powers that be that make the decisions, the so-called initiatives and policies that are the solutions to address issues such as homelessness. There's not a politician that I have ever known, as long as I've been alive, that has run on a platform as being an expert on homelessness, put forth homeless initiatives at the forefront of their campaign platform. And so there's a problem there, because they have to defer to the so-called experts, who I call the poverty pimps, which are a lot of the big nonprofit organizations. And so if there is corruption from the top, then when we talk about trickle-down economics, it's already on a path up to failure. So a lot of homeless individuals that I work with in Skid Row, and I live amongst in Skid Row, when they relying on the powers that be to provide them with the necessary solutions, and it doesn't happen, not only do they extend their homelessness, but they also have become hopeless. And so now instead of entrusting in a system that is supposed to be there to help, it's actually become a hindrance. And so now, in addition to that, they're basically left for self. And so they wind up having to do for self and wind up trying to, as you said, survive. And that in and of itself is a whole different level of disciplinary skills in terms of surviving on the streets. It's different from men, it's different from women, it's different from families. You know, parents with children, it's a whole different level of survival. And so, how do you teach the masses that right now in this current era? As far as the adults, those classes, those lessons can't happen in terms of what's going on in the streets. It would be nice to create new curriculums that would include the necessary explanations so that we all can get the real-time understanding of the truths, so that once we have the truth, we can actually have the real-time conversations. And then from there, then we can talk about having the necessary skill sets to truly address the issues.
Yeah, great. Is there any question? I mean, there's one, two, no, because that hand was before, two, but she has a microphone too. So I'm gonna say it, 1, 2, and 3, okay?
Hi, so I have a question about implementing visionary ideas like this and connecting it to the real world. We all know how the real world works and how really big corporations and in construction industry drive the construction industry forward. And it is amazing to have such great researchers. It's amazing to develop the interdisciplinary professionals. It's amazing to educate the kids. But how do you connect it to the real world construction industry, which is absolutely not interested really, because there is no commercial interest for them in there. How do you bring that commercial interest for them to be interested, which will drive the momentum, which will create the necessity for universities to provide curriculum, to educate the kids, to provide more professionals like that will be needed in the, such developments. So how do you drive this force from real world, construction greediness, commercialism, and how do you connect it with visionary ideas like this?
So I think, just to start that answer, it's a great question. You know, I think that the corporations are very insecure right now. They don't look it, they're making a lot of money, but they don't really have any idea what's going to happen next. And they are like tankers, you know, they can change only very slowly. They're massive organizations. They don't have any agility. And actually what all of the things we're talking about and the kind of training and the kind of change of education and the development of experts is something like agility. It's something like a new generation who actually think completely differently and have a much better perception of the future. So my experience is that the transaction is getting, in many ways, it's changing dramatically. There's something that I would promote, which is, and this I think speaks to it a little bit, is that we should be thinking about, and corporations should be thinking about culture, not brand. Because brand is an imposition on the audience, on the consumer. But the consumer has enormous power right now. When Uber misbehaved and created, you know, a big sexual inequality within Uber, 1.5 million people closed their accounts the next day. So there's a real opportunity for transaction. And so that's one piece of it. The other piece in education is that the future of work is a massive question. Again, the corporations don't really know where that's going with, for example, with AI sort of undermining the possibility of the way in which, or just changing the possibility of the way work may evolve. And so unless those corporations start paying attention to the education system, they are not going to have people who are actually driving the possibility of that future of industry. And that is equally a very powerful transaction. So what we're seeing is corporations are coming into the schools really to ask the questions about what they should be doing next. It's massively imbalanced. It right now is an optimistic view, but I do see that being a very real shift. And that idea of culture, not brand, is really that there is a cultural component to every relationship now between corporation and the individual. Yeah, please.
Can I just add something? I just wanted to, yes, this is the disconnect I'm seeing at the moment is all the massive global developments are actually concentrated in the countries and in the areas where such questions are not taken into consideration. So while Western countries have gone through industrial evolution and have now come to a point where such questions are being considered, at heavily developing countries like China, like Middle East, like Brazil, this would be, for the construction companies, this would be the last thing to consider. So again, there is a disconnect. I understand about the culture. So how do we force developing countries to think about culture before, in conjunction with developing their profits?
The other quick answer is that we are working with civil engineers, a big society of civil engineers right now, who are asking actually also how they should proceed, that they're only looking a very short way into the future, and they're looking for a way of understanding where the future is going. And I think that applies across the world. I think that giving an indication of how change is going to happen, global warming and the massive shift, massive change that creates, requires that those engineers, those construction companies think really differently. And they again, they don't have the agility. They have to start a new kind of transaction.
So, sorry, I think I would say maybe two things, and I'll unpack them. One, there's a lot of assumption in that. I think countries like China, Brazil, Pakistan, countries in Southeast Asia, they are afraid of automation and what that is going to mean, what the possibility of reshoring manufacturing back to Europe, back to US, what is that going to mean for people there? Then you have at the same time with those trends, and what is that going to, at the same time with those trends, you also have the rise of online labor, which weakens the social contract as well. So it weakens people's relationship to the state, and it also draws from the tax base, and it draws, and it means that the state has much less redistributive power for its citizens. So I would say, I would not make the assumption that people in those parts in different parts of the world that is not US and Europe are actually not thinking about those things, because I think a lot of what has happened with the future of work, with the rise of tech, is going to impact heavily, and we will see a massive rise of inequality, which we're seeing anyway already in countries that are not US and Western Europe. The other thing, I think, even when we were talking about education, so like we talk about a system that's already set, and it's set based on an industrial model where you have centrally planned education and so on, and how that is procured and how that is planned and how that is delivered. And one of the things we're grappling with is to say, what would an education system look like if the government procured not from rebuilding kindergarten, but actually procured for results, for an outcome? So what would it look like if it engaged, if a municipality decided that it's going to invest in education for a result, not to redo, not to repaint, but what's going to happen with that kid 20 years from now, and then he paid back then. And this is, I think, if you're in the creative business, and I think these are, and to be honest, you know, people will think maybe there's not people who are doing this, but there's governments around the world that want to try these things out, and we're working with 8 of them on different topics, not in education in particular. Just my team works on 8 of them, with 8, on different issues. How to support farmers in the long run? How do you procure for an outcome? And so I think if you extrapolate that, and I think what is really impressive about actually the process here is the ability to, one, look at that big picture, which is where is it that we want to go? What does that future look like? And then be able to understand the community in the ground, and then draw the differences and what are the different aspects that affect it. And so just because there's a lot of talk of like people fighting for survival and so on, it's never homogenous. right? Any issue you take. So we were working on air pollution in Skopje, for example, and Skopje is consistently one of the top 5 cities, most polluted cities in Europe. And the first thing we thought is, this is a traffic issue. There's massive traffic, there's massive congestion. We found out, actually, it turns out that the communities that are most affected by it are the poorest communities in the city. And the reason why they're most affected by it is because they heat on wood and coal. And they don't have, and the other issue is that there's really poor insulation there, and they don't have access to central heating. So from that actually understanding of how big issue translates, and then working with those communities to thinking, what are the financial aspects that need to go to provide more sustainable solutions? And what does the short term look like? And what does the long term look like? And doing it together with those communities and building in the ethnography together with a high tech, if you wish, and the sensing to be able to come to something that's more comprehensive and something that's more and more holistic, I think, as a solution.
Yeah, I will.
Quickly.
No, go on.
Sorry. In terms of the totem pole of life, where I come from the bottom of the totem pole. And those of us, we recognize that the people that are in power benefit greatly, and they don't want change. So how foolish would we be to continue waiting and waiting and waiting for something that's not going to happen? Not in our lifetime, possibly ever. They're comfortable with the way things are because they're in control and they're benefiting. So, you know, years and years ago, there was the birth of Occupy Wall Street. You know, people were fed up. We say, we don't like what's going on. And the people activated and organized in the streets. Years after that, it was Black Lives Matter. Of course, I'm black, so I guess automatically I'm a member. But technically, I'm not a member of Black Lives Matter. But, you know, I was around a lot of that energy, and people organized in the streets. And when you talk about force, how we forced it, ooh, that's a strong word, force, because it's kind of hard. You know, I wouldn't want anybody to try to force me to do something I wouldn't want to do. So, but there's certainly you can strongly encourage. But, you know, seriously, you know, we, the people, have to organize. There's more of us than it is of them. And so that's where organizing skills, community organizing is so important. And so, you know, the numbers, you know, we the masses, you know, when we go knocking on doors and knocking on, making phone calls and really getting out in the streets and you know, hit now with the blessings of social media, you know, we can reach around the world and just generate this energy that can really create and implement those changes by planting the necessary seeds. And if not, then we kick up a little ruckus and then take it to the next level. But yeah, sitting around waiting won't get it done.
I mean, it's also worth saying that I think that the people in this room are the most powerful people in the world right now. That your ability to go and create stories that do not accept the status quo and speak to a generation now that we're seeing 16-year-old girls taking on climate change and the victims of shootings creating a massive movement, or the women's movement across the US, the movements of women in India against the constraints that they're under. All around the world, there is a massive power, but it requires the kind of messaging and the storytelling that you are the best people in the world to do. And to go back into the smaller communities, but mostly, I think, to create and find a new audience, because the children coming up through school right now, they're the ones who are going to be taking over. And they're an audience which doesn't need to connect to the status quo in any way. They're really not interested. They feel, you know, they don't feel bound by this is how it's going to be, it's never going to change. They expect to get what they want, is what I believe. They just need a framework for that. And that's why I think it comes back to a lot of what we're talking about here, which is just taking fiction and its power and connecting it to reality is actually a massive instrument for change.
And one note there, that's because we feel so powerless as individuals often, but change and emergence comes from the interaction between the particles. If you think about your brain, you're not here or here or here, you're the byproduct of the emergence of the entire system. So if you think of yourself as one of those neurons that is producing that emergence, you can produce a different system to emerge. But that requires choice. And there is one concept that I developed for one of my projects that is the idea of the Trojan horses. So the ideals that we have of our life and how we live and the house and the car, and those are stories that we are telling ourselves. Those are the Trojan horses through which the corporations are entering our life. And we are allowing them in through that story. This is why we need to change the story. This is why we need to change those ideals that we pre-visualize into the future, right? And it's about choice. It's about particles. We cannot feel powerless because we are the most, as Alex was saying, powerful, in the most powerful position to choose. It's just that we have been told we are not. And it's this narrative that is waiting on us that it's kind of eliminating the possibility to reconnect. If you think about filmmaking, what is the ideal? It's not about creating the stories and sharing and creating a different movement. It's about going to the festivals, right? And it's fantastic to do a festival, but at the end, it's about the storytelling. It's about collaborating. It's about challenging how things are done, right? So, I mean, I'm just going to pass to two questions that were here, and then we can continue.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I would just like to give maybe a concrete example, because I do come from Cyprus, which is an island which is divided. And I do believe the educational system is so important, and it does influence, and it changes the narrative. So coming from an island that it is divided in the middle, and we have the Greek Cypriot side on the south and the Turkish Cypriot side on the north, and me really with my small attempt to try to work in bicommunal projects to try and bring these two communities together, and working with children, especially in art projects. From my small experience, from what I discovered is that the educational system, it's so much embedded in them, and the way history is being taught within each community. And I'm not saying, I don't want to say which one is the correct one or which one is the wrong one. My personal opinion, both are wrong. History is being taught wrong in both ways. So it does change the narrative, and from my experience when working in these bicommunal projects, I discovered that children, they didn't have any problem between them, like the Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots. They were playing fine, and even the language barrier was not so important. The problem was their parents. When they were coming together and when they were discussing music and films, it was fine, but they were discussing religion and politics and history. That was a really big problem. So I was very much interested, and what I do find interesting is how history is being taught and how it changes the narrative. And in a very small island, which is very tiny in the Mediterranean Sea, and how we see things differently, within the same subject. Sorry, I'm very emotional.
No. Let's pass the microphone so that we can have the last question.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've been talking basically the whole time, all the time, about systems and logic and everything, but we never really discussed about feelings, because we as human beings, we have feelings, and stories are all about emotions and how does every person feel about a certain subject. And I was gonna say something about homelessness, for example. I mean, of course, yes, there's a lot of problems in the economical side of it, but most of the homeless people, they're just lonely. They need love, and maybe that's what we should also understand, that there is systems we need to change, but also we need to evaluate everybody and make everybody feel as if they're needed. I mean, let's think about the subject with kids. How can I give my kid the best future? Let my kid know what he or she can do best. I mean, we all evaluate each other on this average, that everybody needs to be good in this, and that, and there's marks and everything. But whilst ignoring the actual true talents and what is somebody passionate about, you suppress him. And of course, this person doesn't have any motivation to express himself or be happy and joyous about life, because he's been suppressed his whole life. How can somebody be truly free and creative then?
Yeah, I just want to make one note there before we actually close, because I think precisely we are separating both and is in our lives, but how we think about it is not such. Because feelings are the ways that we interact with each other, are part of what we are talking about as much as trying to rethink the system. The system is just an emergence of that interaction. So if you think about the scales that we talked about, in the human scale, in the community scale, in the street corner that is our laboratory, that's the way in which those particles are interacting. So this is why we bring some questions from other disciplines, but at the same time, it's for us to understand, relating to that question, how can we choose a different interaction for that different system to emerge, right? Okay, do you want to have some last notes?
I just wanted to give Paul and Jen, the
Yes.
experts, a chance to answer that.
No, go ahead.
When I was listening to you, in one sense, I don't disagree with anything you say. And having worked in the education system all my life, it is hugely effective in some cases, and in many cases, it's very destructive for the very reasons that you're saying. In terms of emotion, there's only one emotion that I would want everyone to have and to hold on to. And it's partly an answer to the question we got from over here, and that is optimism. Pessimism kills all of these movements. And we need to be constantly optimistic. And in actual fact, I'm going to be really, really bold now, because I'm very old and I'm going to die. And I don't really care what happens to any of you people. It's me I'm worried about. And I can't make the changes, but you can. You people are all young enough to make the changes. And we saw Buckminster Fuller earlier. Buckminster Fuller said, the only way to do it is to do it. And if I may be very bold, the answer to your question here about taking on the contractors is to take them on. And if you're optimistic, you can do that. It's your life. You are young enough to do it, and you're young enough to get people to tell a different story, and you can tell a story that is different, that will challenge that, in actual fact. And in all my time in the education system, the one thing that is constant is you do not change or solve problems by using the same thinking that created them. And that's why this is crucially important. Finding a new system that steps outside the systems that caused them. And it works. It actually works. And in my own town, we accidentally, in Belfast, discovered that the young people were out there doing it. And the young people have created an economic model in Belfast which stepped outside of the traditional sectarian forms. And we have a system which is blossoming amongst young people, which is bordering on meritorious, and thank God, which is based on the creative industries and creative product. And it makes me want to cry, because I've worked for 40 years to try and make it happen. So all I would say to you is, be optimistic, and just go out and do it, and hopefully do some of it before I die, please.
First, I want to say, I like how you think. You definitely think outside of the box. I'm in America, I'm in Los Angeles, but I'm an ally. So let's keep in contact. So there's two of us. See, your organizing efforts have already begun. Keep it going. As far as feelings, you know, all this talent in the room, let's write scripts with feeling. Let's cast actors and other talents with feelings that can act and portray the feelings on camera. Let's add music that has feelings and soul. You know, let's make and share it with the world. Put the truth out there. You know, that's what filmmaking, the joy of filmmaking. We can talk about whatever we want to talk about. You know, it doesn't have to be right and exact. You know, it's just vivid imagination. Open up. You know, inspire the masses. You know, that's what we need. So through that inspiration, that's where the feeling comes in. That's where the truth comes in. That's where the hope comes in. Because like I said earlier, in terms of homelessness, not only are people homeless, they're hopeless. But now it's just not limited to homeless people anymore. We got a lot of working class folks, you know, like in America, the American dream, people are saying the American dream is gone. You know, and then around the world, so many other countries, third world countries, you know, poverty is spreading. Oops, excuse me. Oh, even my water is spreading over the floor. But, you know, and so it's important for us to hit the reset button. You know, we're human beings. We have feelings. We have emotions. When we make films, when we exercise our talents as artists, let's make sure that we tap into that energy. That's all I have to say. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. That's a great note to end, and unfortunately we have to end because, as always, when we start building the energy, then time goes. But first of all, thank you very much to all of you for coming and spending this time here, because this is why we do what we do, you know? This is why we tell stories. This is why we engage every year on trying to communicate what we have been doing. Thank you to our guests that are here and are spending time, taking time from their amazing projects to be here and work with us. And to Alex, that it's always up front of the Institute and the research. And well, I mean, take what you heard here and bring it home and tell better stories. Thank you.